There have been many protests in the United States, especially at universities over the end of last semester and at the beginning of this current one here, over the Israeli treatment of the Palestinian people inside of Gaza. And a lot of the debate in the United States, especially swirling around a lot of this very emotional issue. Some people saying that all of these protests are anti-Semitic. Some people say no, it's pro for the Palestinian people. There doesn't seem to be any common ground between the two sides, and especially how it's being viewed in American mainstream media. And we want to dig in today to find out what is really going on, both with some of these things, but more importantly, what's going on in Israel. Because a guest that we've had on in the past, it's been too long since he's been on, but we welcome back today Professor Omar Bartov, the professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. First of all, Professor, just welcome back. It's been a long time since we've had you on, and glad to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
And listen, you've just written something not too long ago in The Guardian, which the headline really caught my attention. It says, as a former IDF soldier and historian of genocide, I was deeply disturbed by my recent visit to Israel. Now, you obviously work at Brown University in the United States, but just real quick, I wonder if you can first tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you here, and then what took you back here recently.
Yeah, so I was born in Israel and raised in Israel. I served in the IDF in the 1970s, so through the Yom Kippur War of 1973. I then did my degree, my PhD at Oxford, and went back to Israel and taught at Tel Aviv University for several years. And then in 1989, I moved to the United States and started teaching here. But I've kept my connection with Israel all these years for personal reasons. First of all, a family there, my eldest son lives there and has a family there. My parents lived there until they passed. And most of my best friends still live in Israel, so I go there very often. And in recent years, I've started also writing as a historian on Israel-Palestine.
And so, especially in the context of this current war going on, it's obviously, I guess, putting you kind of in an awkward position or so, especially because one would ordinarily think when you're talking about genocide and Holocaust studies that that's, of course, going to be, quote, pro-Israel, especially as what happened during the Holocaust in Germany and in Europe, rather. But now then, there's somewhat of a change in some stuff. And apparently some of your writings have been on this. In fact, in your article here, you note that you were going to Israel to participate in a conference that was at one of the universities, and you were going to speak on some of these issues. And when word got out before you started, I think on some of the social media, whatever, and a lot of things were going around, and you were being accused of having written a very anti-Israeli piece in the New York Times in November, I think it was, of last year. This is here what I believe is a historian of genocide. In the article, in the Guardian piece, you say guilty is charged on that. First of all, I wonder if you can tell us what actually happened. What was the occasion of you speaking there, and what did you say in that article?
Well, I should say, first of all, that I went to Israel primarily to visit my new grandkids. So this was the first reason. But since I came there, a friend of mine was a professor at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba in the south of Israel, invited me to give a talk. The talk was supposed to be on what's going on in American universities and is it legitimate protest against what is happening, particularly in Gaza, or is it motivated by anti-Semitism, as some people have argued? But when I came to the university, it turned out that some WhatsApp messages had been flying around claiming that I was a traitor to the country and that I should not be allowed to speak. And there were a couple of dozen students there who, it later turned out, had just come back from reserve service, mostly in Gaza, who were protesting against my talk So I couldn't deliver my talk because there was too much noise and banging and a bullhorn and so forth. But after a while, we actually decided to invite them in, those who were willing to speak. And then we sat down and had something like a 2-hour conversation with them, which to me was very interesting, but obviously also very disturbing.
And so let's jump in, because that tails right into some of the things that you wrote about. And I'm wondering if this was part of the motivation that led you to write this article. Gary, if you can put up that first full screen there, quote there. One of the things you wrote is that I had not been to Israel since June 2023. And during this recent visit, I found a different country from the one I had known. And I wonder if you can talk about what you meant there, what motivated you to write that? What did you observe?
So the main thing, I hadn't been to Israel for various reasons for an entire year. So it was, I came there this June. And the main difference that I saw was among people that I know. And I don't know too many right-wing people in Israel. I know mostly people of relatively liberal, left of center views. And it was among those people that I realized something was going on. Now, it was not entirely surprising, but it was still quite shocking to me, especially speaking with people that I've known for many years. The main thing was that people simply had no empathy whatsoever to the faith of Palestinians in Gaza, to what Israel is actually carrying out in Gaza. And there were many people I spoke with who are strongly critical of the Netanyahu government, who have no love lost for people such as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the right-wing extremists in his government, who would like to see an exchange of hostages and a ceasefire, but they have no interest whatsoever in what's happening to Palestinians. And when I spoke with them about that and said, look, I mean, there are tens of thousands of people being killed there. There are thousands of children who've died there because of Israeli action. I could see their eyes glaze over and they would just change the subject. They did not want to talk about that at all. And that was quite disturbing to me. And that's quite apart from the encounter with the soldiers that we can talk about that raised a whole lot of other issues as well.
And let's just actually, I guess, riff off that a minute for the Israeli soldiers. You said some of those who came to your speech were Israeli soldiers as well, and there has been some claim that the rules of engagement from the outset have been anybody who moves in the target zone is an enemy, and you don't even have to worry about identifying anybody. You just shoot everybody who's there, which, at least by some accounts, is why those 3 Israeli hostages were killed earlier in the conflict when they were discovered and tried to say, I'm Israeli, but whatever, they were just all shot on the spot. What is your understanding of what is the rules of engagement, or are they actually the right thing written down, but just not being executed on the ground? What is your understanding?
Well, we don't actually know precisely what the rules of engagement are because they haven't been published. They haven't been made public. But clearly from that event that took place already quite a while ago, it was clear that there are areas in which, and we know that even before the war in Gaza, in previous operations in Gaza, there are areas in which the army declares that this area will be an area of operations, and therefore it tells the population to leave, and it gives the population a certain amount of time to go. And after that time passes, hypothetically, anybody who is there is considered to be an enemy and can be shot at. And that's apparently what happened in this case. But if you talk about rules of engagement, you're speaking also about military discipline. I mean, whether there are or there aren't rules of engagement, is anything being enforced? And the impression is, and in fact, the soldiers that I was speaking with also confirmed that, there is a great amount of indiscipline within the ranks of the IDF in Gaza, in the regular army, and even more so among the reservists. And that is an expression of I'd say, the mid-ranking echelons, the sort of battalion commanders, brigade commanders, many of whom are much more right-wing, much more fanatical than the upper echelons of the army, the sort of the top echelons. And the army wants them to operate. There is a kind of decline of motivation generally because this war has been going on for so long. But it does not quite know how to enforce discipline on these soldiers. The best indication of that is, of course, the postings by soldiers, which are illegal. Postings which show brutalities, which show theft, looting, wanton destruction of property. And the army tells those soldiers, you're not allowed to do that. It's bad for a reputation. And yet the soldiers do it anyway, and rarely is anyone punished. And so you have a situation where the army is operating. It's obviously overwhelmingly more powerful than its enemies, but there is a clear sense of growing indiscipline, both for ideological reasons and simply because of attrition in the ranks of the army.
Now, I want to get into one of the things that you're kind of mentioned or you alluded to right there, which also stood out to me in the article that you wrote, in that, you know, it's a common thing that a lot of people say history didn't start on October 7th of last year. Things go back further. But you kind of talked about in there that even from the other side of the equation, they also didn't start from October 7th. And you specifically refer to a 1987 incident that happened in the IDF. Gary, if you can bring up that number 3 piece there, because you say that when the first Palestinian Intifada or uprising broke out in late 1987, I was teaching at Tel Aviv University. I was appalled by the instruction of Yitzhak Rabin, then Minister of Defense of the IDF, to, quote, break the arms and legs, end quote, of the Palestinian youths who were throwing rocks at heavily armed troops. I wrote a letter to him warning that based on my research into indoctrination of the armed forces of Nazi Germany, that was going to be a problem. I wonder if you can explain, because you went into some detail about that he wrote back a couple of times. What was the result of that, and what was your concern even back in 1987?
Well, I was quite young then. I was an assistant professor at Tel Aviv University. I just written in my PhD dissertation and published my first book that had to do with the brutalization of the German army, particularly fighting on the Eastern Front. And that brutalization was caused by a combination of the kind of education that they received in the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, indoctrination in the army, and then the realities of warfare on the Eastern Front, which was very brutal. And that led to the killing of millions of Soviet civilians. Altogether, about 30 million Soviet citizens were killed during the German invasion of the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1944. So I had come back from this research, and I was still a reserve officer and was likely to be called up when the Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, began in December 1987. And Rabin then issued this statement, break their arms and legs. And what made me particularly sort of aware of what was going on was that there was a particular case where a few military police picked up a Palestinian boy, took him on their Jeep, and then threw him out of the Jeep, and he fell and was killed. And I was totally appalled. And so what I meant in writing here was to say, look, the army under your leadership is on a slippery slope. You are calling for brutalization. You're inciting this kind of violence. You have to stop that. And the interesting thing was that 2 weeks after I sent him this postcard that I never expected him to answer, I received a letter from the Ministry of Defense, and I opened the letter, and there was a response with his signature saying, how dare you compare the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, to the IDF, to the Israeli Defense Forces. And then I wrote him a second letter explaining my thinking and my research. And again, he responded to me with the same line, more or less. Now, what was interesting in this was that I think that Rabin specifically understood at some point, and it wasn't me, of course, it was a much larger issue than what I wrote in, began to understand that what was happening was a consequence of the occupation that began in 1967, and that Israel would not be able to sustain that occupation in the long run, militarily, politically, and morally, and that it would corrupt the army, it would corrupt society, and it would become non-viable for Israel internationally. And that was partly why he became involved in the Oslo process, which for all its faults was an attempt to resolve this issue, to create two separate states. But he was assassinated in 1995, not least because of incitement by Benjamin Netanyahu at the time. And since then, it's Benjamin Netanyahu and his ilk who have been at the forefront of Israeli politics. And what we see now, in many ways, is the bitter fruits of the failure of that process in the 1990s to resolve this issue politically rather than militarily.
And I want to talk some more about that evolution there. I actually had forgotten about that assassination and how that kind of changed the course of things. And I did want to talk about the beginning of the rise of Netanyahu in the 90s, at least up to the prime ministership. Obviously, it started before that. But one of the other things, Gary, if you can bring up number 4 there, is that you comment here that since 1989, I've been teaching in the United States, and I have written profusely on war, genocide, Nazism, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. In the months since October 7th, what I've learned over the course of my life and career has become more painfully relevant than ever. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you see as I don't know if you call it progress or regression, that alarms you about the state of mind and the comparison between the evolution that you studied about in Germany and what you see going on in the Israeli society today.
So look, this is something that you raised at the beginning of our conversation. I mean, it is not just ironic, it's tragic that Israel now stands accused or suspected of genocide, because we have to remember, I mean, the state of Israel was created basically on the ashes of the Holocaust, and it was supposed to be the country that would finally resolve this question. It was the answer to the fate of Jews over centuries, who were a minority, often persecuted, and finally subjected to genocide by Nazi Germany. And it was also supposed to be an answer to anti-Semitism. And the Genocide Convention itself of 1948, in many ways, was a response to the atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide of World War II, and particularly a response to the Holocaust. And so to think that that country, which was created at the end of this horror of the Holocaust, is now accused of genocide is obviously deeply troubling. But nonetheless, we cannot simply stand by and say you cannot blame Israel of these crimes, because in the past it was Jews who were subjected to them. The fact of the matter is that in November, I wrote this op-ed in the New York Times saying, look, there are good reasons to think that the IDF is committing war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. There's still not enough proof that there is genocide, but we are, again, on this kind of slippery slope, and it is time to stand back and stop this process. And when I went there in June, I had already become convinced in the weeks before that, especially after the IDF moved into Rafah on the 8th of May, that it was indeed the genocidal process, that Israel was engaged in a systematic attempt to make life impossible for Palestinians in Gaza, first of all by killing, and then by targeted destruction of infrastructure, of universities, of schools, of mosques, of residences, and of imposing heavy restrictions on supplies of aid, so that the population now is completely debilitated and is being moved from one place to another into so-called safe zones, where they tend to get repeatedly bombed and killed. And we know now from statements that are being made as I speak in Israel from the right wing that the general intent is to make at least the northern part of Gaza completely empty of the population. And then there are many people on the Israeli right who are speaking now of settling that area and then pushing the population further and further south and making conditions so difficult for it that it would either die out or flee. And that is, according to the Genocide Convention, it means that the IDF and the Israeli government are creating conditions that would, in whole or in part, destroy the Palestinian population in Gaza. And I have to say that it's extraordinary that up to now, Israel has been allowed to get away with this without any major pressure on it to stop, not political and not military, in the sense of finally stopping the endless supply of munitions to Israel.
Well, and along those lines, you say you find those things extraordinary. I find things extraordinary from a different perspective, relatedly, from this side of the equation in the United States, because earlier this afternoon, we had the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, try to tell everybody that we are really close to the finish line to getting a ceasefire done. Watch this.
Right now, we're working intensely with our Egyptian and Qatari counterparts to work together to bridge any remaining gaps. And in the coming time, very soon, we'll put that before the parties, and we'll see what they say. I think what is evident, though, is the strong interest that everyone in the region has in being able to get the ceasefire concluded.
You know, I'm not sure that everyone in the region is excited about seeing a ceasefire. And in fact, based on what you literally just said about what's being said about the northern part of the Gaza Strip, it would seem that they don't want a ceasefire because they want to continue moving militarily to have, I don't even know how you would define it, but some sort of military solution to the problem. How do you see that?
Well, look, Blinken, God bless him, he's been saying this now for months. And it's total fantasy. It's fantasy because Benjamin Netanyahu has no intention whatsoever of reaching any deal. Most people in Israel now have understood it too. That's why you have hundreds of thousands out in the streets. He does not want a solution to this issue, for pragmatic reasons, because he knows that any agreement that he reaches over the hostages, which would mean that the IDF would move out of Gaza, would topple his government. And then there's a process that at the end of which he might end up in jail. First of all, he is already under indictment. And secondly, he would finally have to agree, or there would be an agreement on a state commission of inquiry on the fiasco of October 7th and thereafter. So he has no intention of doing it. But it's not only for his sort of personal reasons. It's also because I believe, and I'm not the only one, he very much actually wants to change the map. He wants, in fact, to start a process. It's a process that in many ways has started already, of taking over large parts of Gaza and making it impossible for Palestinians to live there. You have to remember that 20% of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip, has already been created into a buffer zone. This is areas surrounding the entire Gaza Strip within the territory of the Gaza Strip that have been stripped of everything, of any buildings or anything, so as to create a buffer between the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And now there are between 200,000 and 300,000 Palestinians in the northern part, the northern third of the Gaza Strip. And it is clear that the intent is to squeeze them out of there. This would be, of course, contrary to any international law, but international law doesn't seem to have mattered much up to now. And then gradually to start annexing larger and larger parts of this. In general, the plan that seems to be at work, although it has not been clearly articulated, is to make Gaza into something that would look like the West Bank. And what is happening in the West Bank is beginning to look increasingly like what we see in Gaza. That is, the IDF is working there with increasing forces. The Air Force is involved there. Drones are involved there. More and more people being killed also there. And so to make these two areas into areas that are under direct military control, while making life increasingly impossible for the people who live there, in the hope that they would finally leave and more of this land could be annexed to Israel. That is what Netanyahu himself, I believe, would actually like to see.
And so let me ask you, how could that be accomplished? Because he has said militarily he wants to, quote, destroy Hamas to bring peace to the people of Israel. That's his stated objective. But then when you look at how he's employing military forces, I've said several times, based on my own combat experience in similar kinds of even large scale urban type of battles, is that by this wanton destruction and the killing of so many innocent people, the number of whether you call them Hamas or any other title, people who wish ill to Israel is only increased probably exponentially. There's so much motivation for them to hate Israel far more than they did on October 7th. Ergo, it would seem that he is moving further and further away from his goal of bringing peace to Israel the more force he uses. But that maybe he has a different plan. And I wonder, just based on your observation, what does he genuinely think he can accomplish with military force?
His goal is not to bring peace to Israel. Peace is a greatly overused term. His goal is to make Eretz Israel, the entire territory between the Jordan and the sea, including now the Gaza Strip, into an area where there's Jewish hegemony and as few Palestinians as possible. And so you're right, of course, that when you fight militants such as Hamas, for everyone you kill, there would be 2, 3 more fighters. And Hamas is still fighting after 10 months of intense efforts by the IDF, which is a much more powerful military organization than Hamas ever was. But eventually, if Israel manages to actually push the Palestinians out of Gaza, or the majority of them, then in his own view, that problem would be solved. They'd be on the other side of the border. I don't think that is possible.
I was going to say, do you think that's even theoretical, even plausible militarily, and also diplomatically and politically in the rest of the world, even the Western world, if they would physically to move those people out of there or kill so many that it became depopulated? It seems that there might be an upper limit even to what the West and the United States would hold, or at least I think there would.
I think so, but the problem is that I don't think anybody would have imagined that Israel could kill 40,000 people and still be allowed to, so to speak, negotiate. Yes, I think there is an upper limit, but I don't know what that upper limit is. But there are other limitations on Israel. The fact of the matter is that under Netanyahu's leadership, on a daily basis, Israel is getting weaker and not stronger. It's getting weaker militarily. It's getting weaker politically in the international arena. It's getting weaker also in terms of its own social solidarity. And it is now involved in a war that it cannot win against Hezbollah, in a war it cannot win, or a kind of shadow war it cannot win against Iran, with large numbers of Shiite militias also in Syria. And it has 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, 2 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And this idea that you can solve all this and accomplish a greater Israel, empty of Palestinians, in the long run, I don't think will work. But in the short and medium run, it seems to me that if Israel is allowed to get away with this under Netanyahu, it is in the process of establishing a full-on apartheid regime. And that could last for a while, could last for a few years, for a decade or 2 decades. Eventually, I think it will implode. But at the moment, Israel is not being held back. And these comments by Secretary Blinken show that the United States is simply playing Netanyahu's game and is not doing what President Biden could have done in November or December last year and could have said to Netanyahu, look, either you reach a ceasefire or you're on your own. He didn't say it then, and now we're seeing the results of that.
Well, and that's an interesting observation. Really, it's something we have said here on this channel a number of times, that the United States is, whether wittingly or unwittingly, I'll leave that to others to decide, has enabled a lot of this, and certainly at the United Nations diplomatically continued to go on here. But we have, at least on the surface, a dichotomy between what the U.S. says it wants and what Israel, and I'll specify Netanyahu, says he's willing to do. Because you have Biden, who has relentlessly, and now Kamala Harris, who also recently said, a two-state solution. Everything has got to be a two-state solution. And yet, when addressed on that, and this is from, I think, January here, here's what Benjamin Netanyahu says.
In the future, the state of Israel have to control on the entire area from the river to the sea. This is what happens when you have sovereignty. This truth I say to our American friends. And I also stopped the attempt to impose us a reality that will jeopardize us. A prime minister in Israel has to be able to say no, even to the best of friends.
And it seems he is very successful at saying no to his friends, and yet he still keeps getting all of these hundreds of airplane loads and shiploads of ammunition and weapons. They don't seem to be stopping down. So do you see any chance that Netanyahu is going to change course, or is he going to keep going down that path? And by the way, if I could also get you to explain to our American audience what he means when he says from the river to the sea.
So Netanyahu speaks a very good English, a very good Hebrew, but he says different things in Hebrew and in English. So this was in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, he says, I have no intention of any peace with Palestinians or anything of the sort. We need to be in control of the whole territory. When he speaks in English, he says, well, we can negotiate. We have to make sure that we are secure. Obviously, we want to preserve human rights and so forth. What he means from the river to the sea is what Palestinians call historic Palestine. That is the entire territory from, the border with Lebanon and with Syria, along the Jordan Valley, along the line separating the Negev from the Sinai Peninsula, and now including the Gaza Strip, which Israel had sort of given up on because he couldn't maintain it, because it was just too costly in blood and also in capital. And now, of course, they're in the process of absorbing it again. There is a real irony in all this, I must say, if you think about it historically. Only between 1948 and 1967, so from the establishment of Israel and the end of Israel's War of 1948, which is known in Israel as the War of Independence, until the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel accomplished the goal of Zionism, which was to create a Jewish majority state. 80% of the people, of the citizens of Israel, were Jews, and only 20% were Palestinians, largely because the rest had been evicted, expelled. But in 1967, Israel captured the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Much of the population in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank were people who were refugees from the War of 1948. And so it absorbed back the people that it had expelled. And we now have a situation in Israel of 50-50. There are 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews in the area controlled by Israel. Of the Palestinians, 2 million Israeli citizens, who are in many ways second-class citizens, and the others are occupied population. And so that question, how do you resolve that, has been at the core of Israeli politics. And yet, in the last 2 decades, under Netanyahu, he has argued consistently that we can manage this issue. Somehow, we don't need to talk about the occupation. In fact, it's not even called an occupation in Israel anymore. It's an area that belongs to historic Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And on October 7th, that whole idea, that whole paradigm exploded in everyone's face because Hamas attacked viciously, brutally, killing hundreds of civilians, but showed that you cannot keep that group under the rug, that you have to resolve it. And now the question is, do you resolve it by military force, meaning expulsion, suppression, and ultimately genocide, or do you do it politically? And to do it politically, to accomplish this politically, there's not enough force in Israel. There's not enough of a public in Israel today to push for that on its own. It can only happen with outside pressure, and the most important pressure has to come from the United States, from the American government. And the American government has somehow played into the hands of Netanyahu, and I'm hoping that in the near future, we see a change in that, not just for American national interests, but for Israeli national interests, and obviously also because of the horrors that are now being visited on Palestinians.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder, actually, real quick, if you can also help our American audience understand something that's kind of confusing to a lot of Americans when they hear one term just like Israeli Jews, and then they also hear a Zionist. And the Zionist, depending on who's saying it, can either be a pejorative or it can be a compliment to somebody. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit of the nuance of that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that Zionism, which appeared in the late 19th century, was a movement that believed in Jewish self-determination. Jews were dispersed all over Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and Zionists said the Jews, like other nations, are a nation, and they have a right of self-determination. And then the question was, but where would they live, because they were dispersed? And the answer was eventually, well, they'll go back to their ancestral land. They had been expelled 2,000 years earlier, and they'll go to the land that they pray to, as religious Jews pray to Jerusalem. And that was the beginning of Zionism. But functionally, when Jews started coming to Palestine, it turned out, of course, that Palestine was not empty. So the Zionist slogan was, a people without a land to a land without a people. But there was a people there. There were Palestinians, and they, in large part, also in response to Zionist colonization of that land, formed their own national movement and claimed we are a nation and we have a right of self-determination. So it became both a kind of settler colonial movement and a struggle between two national groups. And that struggle has not been resolved, and each group says it's all mine. Now, that's part of it. I believe, in large part, that Zionism accomplished its goal with the establishment of the State of Israel. And it was, in many ways, a liberation movement. It was to liberate Jews from the kind of conditions that they'd lived in as a minority, as a persecuted, oppressed minority. It was to liberate them from that. But once the state was established, instead of then saying, okay, now we have a state, let's follow the precepts of the Declaration of Independence, which were highly liberal and democratic. Instead, it did not establish a constitution. There is no constitution in Israel. And Zionism, as a result, became a kind of state religion, which is ethno-national, which says this place is only ours, and anyone else who is here is unwanted, maybe tolerated, maybe we could get rid of them, but it's our nation state, and nobody else belongs here. And that sort of process changed the nature of Zionism to the extent that now you have people who call themselves Zionists in Israel, who are in many ways Jewish supremacists, who have strong eliminationist tendencies, who are racist. Now, I don't think that that's what, let's say, people like my parents who were Zionists believed in, but that ideology got distorted over time. And so I believe that Jews have a right of self-determination. I think that the state of Israel has a right to exist, but I think it has a dire need to transform itself into a just society where Jews and Palestinians and others can live in equality and with dignity. And that today is not possible.
It's not. And I think one of the other things you highlighted in your Guardian piece there, which seems to work directly against that objective, is that you were talking about specifically how there seems to be a dehumanization, not just of the Palestinians in general, but of the children in particular. You had made some comments about how they didn't even regard some of the children as being problematic. And I saw this recent clip by Daniel Hagari, which seems to be similar in basically saying they're not real people. Watch this.
In the next couple of minutes, we're going to go down into the tunnel shaft 20 meters below where the hostages were murdered. The tunnel shaft was in a children's room, in a house. Those are the walls of this children's room with Snow White and Mickey Mouse on the wall, and a tunnel shaft where hostages were murdered downstairs, 20 meters below the ground.
He seemed to really focus on this is a Palestinian kid's room, and it was used to be murder. So don't have any sympathy for him is the unstated message there. But then that is really contrasted. Gary, if you can bring up number 5 there, it really stood out to me. Was that you said that knowing that I had previously warned of genocide, the students were especially keen to show me that they were humane, that they were not murderers. They had no doubt the IDF was, in fact, the most moral army in the world. How do you reconcile those two paths where, one, you view the other side is almost not even human and don't have any sympathy even for the children dying, and then the second say that your military is the most moral in the world? It seems when you're on those tracks here, that can lead to all kinds of bad things.
Yes, it does. Look, I mean, people never want to think of themselves. Most people, if they're not totally pathological, don't want to think of themselves as murderers. And soldiers, whether the soldiers that I speak about in that article, German soldiers in World War II or Israeli soldiers today, they want to believe they're fighting for a just cause and they're doing it decently. But then they have an image of the other side, and that image of the other side is largely that those people are not human, that those people don't have any rights to have rights. And your goal, not just for yourself, but for humanity in general, is to be rid of them. And so by exerting violence, you're actually doing a good thing and not a bad thing. Now, it meets all kinds, you encounter all kinds of contradictions in that. And that's why these young men and women who were in their 20s, those people that I met, said, you are accusing us of genocide. We are not murderers. Look how we took care of children. And they show me photographs of children. They say there's no hunger in Gaza. They came to us and we gave them all the food that we had, which means, of course, that the children were hungry. And that's why they needed the food. So they want to think of themselves, as most people do, as good, humane people who are doing their best to protect their nation, protect their country. They're sacrificing themselves. Many have been killed, of course. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers have also been killed. And they cannot see. They have this huge blind spot. They cannot see that what they're doing, what they are seeing, because most of the Israeli public doesn't see Gaza and doesn't want to watch it. But the soldiers there do see it. They cannot accept the fact that they're actually engaged in a huge operation of destruction, in a war of destruction of the entire strip. So yes, it is a contradiction. You find it, I think, maybe from your experience, from everything that I've studied, soldiers find themselves being later on accused of having done something that they were told at the time was the right thing to do. My fear with these soldiers that I spoke with, these reserve soldiers, is that potentially they could become the political soldiers of a new type of Israeli fascism, because they feel that they are not being listened to. They feel that nobody cares about them. They don't actually trust their own military commanders. I was talking with them about it. They feel that they're doing the dirty work and everybody else is complaining. And they can be mobilized by political leaders, fascist, populist political leaders, of whom there's quite a few in Israel, to become these kind of political soldiers who will enforce a different kind of rule on Israel itself. And so that the horrible war in Gaza will boomerang directly back into Israeli society itself.
And let me ask you, from all of your experience with genocide studies and the Holocaust and all of that, and other studies throughout history or other similar kind of movements happened in the condition that it's in right now in Israel, is there any way to find an off-ramp to prevent it from going down the darker paths which you've seen it done in the past?
Look, I mean, there is an off-ramp. I've been talking about it now for months. The off-ramp is, instead of thinking that you can resolve this militarily, and no one can win this conflict, that you reach an understanding that there must be a dramatic change in the political paradigm. And large parts of the region want that. Egypt wants it, Saudi Arabia wants it, Jordan wants it, the Gulf states want it. They want to accept Israel into this world, partly because they're afraid of Iran, partly because they think that Israel could be a good partner. But you can't do it without resolving the issue of the Palestinians. So yes, there is, but the problem is that the people who have the power right now in Israel, are completely unwilling to do that. They have their own goals, whether they are messianic, such as people like Smotrich, who believe that God is on their side, and whether they're cynical, like Netanyahu, who has no God. They don't want that. And the question is, can you change that leadership? I believe that there are people in Israel who would like to go that way. But right now, they are stunned into a kind of, either they are on the side of the messianic lot, or they have been debilitated themselves. And you see very much the same thing on the Palestinian side. And that's why I'm saying there has to be much more effort from the outside, because if this continues, things will only get worse, and they'll get worse for everyone in the region. It'll have repercussions in the United States. It'll have repercussions on the rise of anti-Semitism. It will embolden more and more radical right-wing forces in Europe and in the United States. And somehow, nobody is moving in that direction. We hear these kind of lame statements by Secretary Blinken. They're not helping. They're really not helping. And there has not been a decision, I'm afraid, in the American administration. Maybe if there is a new one, hopefully, from my point of view, under Harris, to change that. But right now, there doesn't seem to be the impetus and the understanding that a change must be made now before things get totally off the rails.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up about some of the lame statements, because I think this one also from today has to fit in that category. I almost want to watch your eyes and see if they roll as he's saying this, but well, watch this and then we'll talk on the backside.
More than 90% of the issues have been agreed, decided. So we're down to a handful of issues, not even a handful of issues, that are hard, but fully resolvable in our judgment. And as we said before, when you get down to the last 10%, the last 10 meters, those are almost by definition the hardest ground to cover. But we believe that these are fully resolvable.
So we're a couple of things. There's that one, and then this other one here where he's talking about the Egyptian American, I think it was, who was killed in the West Bank, who was come for. That was even worse. Watch this one.
No one should be shot and killed for attending a protest. No one should have to put their life at risk just for freely expressing their views. In our judgment, Israeli security forces need to make some fundamental changes in the way that they operate in the West Bank, including changes to their rules of engagement.
So what do you think the chances are that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to hear that and say, darn it, we need to change our rules of engagement and change fundamentally how we engage in the West Bank? How do you think that's going to strike?
Yeah, she's Turkish American, And
Turkish guy, right.
from everything I read about her, was a very extraordinary young woman, and she was shot in the head. By all accounts, after the protest was over, standing in an olive grove by an Israeli soldier, assassinated. And the IDF says, yes, we will investigate it. And we have discovered now, some of us knew it for a long time, that the IDF has built for itself a sort of legal system where they investigate. They have lawyers everywhere, and they're investigating. But these investigations are meant simply as fig leaves for the international community, and particularly for international courts, because nobody ever is found guilty. Even now, they also said, well, we don't think it was intentional, and we'll investigate further. And nothing ever happens after that. How does that change? Again, it changes only out of pressure. Look, I mean, the U.S., when I was speaking with those students, they said, why is there an American embargo on Israel? I said, an American embargo? I never heard of that. The only thing that had been prohibited by the United States temporarily was sending those 2,000-pound bombs.
Temporarily.
That's the only thing. And I said, because they were killing large numbers of civilians, being dropped on schools that were declared as refugee shelters because there might have been a couple of Hamas people underneath. And the soldier said, no, we've been to these schools. They're full of Hamas people. So had there been a decision by the United States in public to say, look, we want a deal now with Hamas. Hamas, by all accounts, wants a deal. Not because they're good guys, but because they really need a deal. They're not in good shape right now. The majority of the Israeli public wants a deal because they want the hostages back. The Israeli public is tormented by the fact that you have scores of people still living in these horrible tunnels. The reason, Hagari went down to this tunnel, the reason that they were shot was because the IDF was nearby. And there were Hamas observers, and that's what the IDF said, who reported to the guards of those hostages, and they shot them before they ran away. So everything that the IDF is doing now ensures that more hostages will die. Although they're saying that they're trying to save them, their own actions are either killing them directly or causing the assassination, the murder by Hamas. So none of this will change without pressure on Netanyahu. Had the United States said, look, stop. If you don't stop, we're not providing you with arms. It would have taken 2 weeks, and that would be the end. Now, the administration doesn't do it for domestic reasons, obviously. Right. But in the long run, this is, to my mind, a deeply mistaken policy. And these kind of statements, everyone can see these statements by Blinken. Everybody can see, everybody knows that it's just words, that nobody pays attention to it. And if the most powerful country in the world, on which Israel is totally dependent, diplomatically and militarily, with aircraft carriers now surrounding it, right, cannot make Israel change its policy, then something is wrong with American policy vis-a-vis Israel. And I think it has to change. Again, not simply, I think it will serve American national interests. I think it also will serve Israeli national interests and will finally put an end to this senseless slaughter that has been going on for almost a year.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the arguments that I repeatedly make, is that our policies here, while it may please the Israeli lobby who provides money for a lot of these politicians, perversely worsens the situation for Israel itself. If you only cared about Israeli people, if you didn't even care about the Palestinians, you should want America to finally hold Netanyahu and his government accountable so that the killing can stop and even get to stability. I won't even use the word peace, but at least can get back to stability where it becomes possible over time to improve things. But until that happens, it's going to continue deteriorating for everybody, I think.
Yeah, look, I mean, now the Israeli north has been entirely depopulated. tens of thousands of Israelis have abandoned the settlements, their towns, villages, because of Hezbollah daily shelling, rockets, drones. Hundreds and hundreds of homes have been destroyed, schools, other structures, agricultural structures, and the Israeli government is doing nothing about it. The way to stop it, again, is, and of course it's been happening on the other side too, in southern Lebanon, just as much as in northern Israel. So thousands of civilians are suffering from this. And the only way to stop it, and Hezbollah says that openly, is to end the war in Gaza. And so you find the whole region in a state of complete stalemate, largely and first of all, I must say, because of one man, one individual. The army has been saying now for months that it has no more goals in Gaza. There's nothing it can do. It has reached all its goals. Now, obviously, it has not released the hostages, and Hamas is still fighting. But it has taken over everything. There's nothing it can do anymore. And Israeli soldiers are dying also completely in vain. And this one man, because he believes that he must stay in power for his own interest, but I think also he thinks of himself as some kind of historical figure, that he's the only person who can lead Israel, is holding everyone in this extraordinary situation. And he can do it because he's allowed to do it by the United States. He's also allowed to do it by European leaders, and not least by Germany. I mean, there's a whole other question.
Yeah.
In Britain now, there's a little bit of a change, but very, very hesitant changes. I must say, it's absolutely, it's so tragic to see this for having lasted so long. And I don't see it changing after the American elections.
Well, yeah, one of the things I was going to comment on I mean, the idea that the current administration is going to make any changes prior to the election is absolutely impossible. Not any chance, zero. But it's unclear whether President Harris or President Trump, either one, would make any different. Would they do the same thing here? And that's part of the discouragement, I think. But let me ask you, in the last bit of time we have here, let's look beyond the current front lines here, because there are many in the United States that really, and we show it on this channel a lot, that literally lust for war with Iran. And they keep saying over and over that all of these problems, they all go to Iran. Tehran is the real head of the snake, and they control everything else. And if you just knock that head of the snake off, then all Israel's problems will just go away. What do you say to that?
It's nonsense, and it's what Netanyahu has been pushing now for years and years. Of course, you remember a speech there with the sketch of the bomb that he made in the UN some years ago. No, it's nonsense. Look, Iran is ruled by a theocratic, violent regime that oppresses its own people, and there's nothing positive to be said about Iran. And there are many Iranians who would be very happy if that regime were to go. But while it is certainly a disruptor in the Middle East, it plays a role that's exactly the photo. And it plays a role in Middle East politics. The main problem for Israel has been, since before 1948, since 1921, 1929, has been, how do you share that space between Jews and Palestinians? How do you create a situation there that these two groups that have actually a great deal in common find a way to live together, with a border between them, without a border between them, whatever arrangement you find? If Iran disappeared tomorrow, if Iran suddenly had a democratic revolution, that problem would not go away.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, if these people, and I'm talking mainly about the United States, but obviously Netanyahu's one of the big cheerleaders of it, if they got their way and war did come, and by the way, as we're sitting here talking here, we're still waiting on a potential ticking time bomb, because Iran is going to respond to what happened with the assassination of Hania in Tehran back in July, I think it was. So this still could be waiting on a spark. And actually, I want to ask you specifically a question about that. It appears to me that Netanyahu is actually banking on some kind of response from Iran, and whenever it comes, however measured anything else, that it's going to then be used as justification to launch some kind of counterstrike again against Iran, which could then spark a war. How do you see that dynamic?
I think that Netanyahu's policy right now is to try and do whatever he can to make sure that Trump becomes president of the United States, and that he probably believes that his chances will increase if he creates more mayhem in his own region, because then the administration would not know what to do, would be embarrassed by that, and would be torn between its more moderate Jewish supporters and people on the left who supposedly also support the Democratic Party. I think he is hoping that the next president would be Trump, whether it would be good for him or not. Now, that may include also conflict with Iran. I mean, Netanyahu is not insane. He is cynical. He is also a coward in many ways, but he's not insane. There is no way of winning a war against Iran. The United States will not win a war against Iran. It's not a country that you're going to win a war against. You can bomb a lot of people there, kill a lot of people there, maim that country, but they're not going to win a war. So that's not what he's interested in. And his entire rhetoric, which is also so interesting, he spoke, as in this image that you showed, constantly about Iran developing nuclear arms, right? What Israel is facing now is not that. It's not facing a danger of nuclear war. What it's facing is the limits of its own power in the region. That as long as the IDF is fighting in Gaza, Israel actually cannot launch a major campaign in Lebanon, even if it wanted to, because it doesn't have enough troops. It's conventional. It's not all this rhetoric about the atom bomb. It was all empty rhetoric, so as to, as has been his goal for many, many, many years, divert attention from the main issue, which is the occupation and the Palestinian population. That is what he's always been focused on. And the rest is just empty rhetoric. So in that sense, yes, I think he may well try. I don't know if the army, because I think there is pressure on him now from the army. There's a lot of pressure in Israel now for the heads of the security establishment to resign, because they all know that he's not giving them any goals and that there's no way that he will agree to any kind of arrangement. But the fear is that if they resign, the chief of staff and the head of the Mossad and the head of the Shin Bet, if they resign, then he will just say, well, of course they resigned because they were guilty of October 7th, not me, it was them. And he will then appoint his own yes men. And so they don't resign, although they are complicit in everything that is going on. And so I don't, as I say, he will try to do whatever he can to maintain the situation, maybe even make it worse, so as to make life more difficult for the current administration in the US. And he's hoping that then Trump will come in. And if Trump doesn't come in, and it's a Democratic administration, he will use all his power to influence those lobbies in the United States that are crucial to a democratic administration. And Israel has its tentacles has built for a long time in power centers in the United States. They don't represent the Jewish population of the United States, and those who think that, are sort of verging toward anti-Semitism. But it has built up a great deal of power and influence in, I'd say, lobbies, financial interests, economic interests, military production, technology in the United States. And those are linked to both that's my interest. University administrations and the running of major universities, especially the sort of big, important universities, and to the Democratic Party. And Netanyahu will try to use his leverage as best he can, again, to make sure that there's no pressure on him to finally change his policy. I think it's possible to do that. There will be a price. If there is a Democratic administration, it could do it right away, not wait, when it still has, when it's sort of victorious and it's still in power. But if what we've seen up to now is an indication of what will happen in the future, then one has to remain skeptical.
Right. Yeah, there is that reality that has to be playing in here. And listen, I cannot tell you how grateful I am for you to come on our show and just providing such an extraordinary amount of clarity and criticism on this big problem here. And anyone who hasn't seen this exceptional article here in The Guardian that you wrote, we're showing on the screen there, recommend you go and take a look at it and read the thing, all of it for yourself. Professor Bartov, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And folks, this is just another example that we are unintimidated and uncompromised. I don't care if anybody doesn't like this kind of show. And I know that a lot of people don't like anything that says anything negative against the government of Israel. But as we're showing here, it's actually harmful to the people of Israel itself to continue following these policies blindly and just giving them whatever they want to. It's not good for America. It's not good for Israel. And it's definitely not good for the Palestinian people. We want to see all of them be able to live in peace or at least in stability and have a future and a hope together sometime in the future. Thanks for watching today. Be sure and like and subscribe to this channel, folks. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.